Okay, so my name is Brittany Boston, and I am part of the Forum Planning Committee and with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. I almost got my own agency name incorrect. But I just want to thank you for joining us for today's session. This is the last group of breakouts for the forum, and we have saved the best for last. So just a few housekeeping items before I hand it over to our presenter. You are currently muted and in listen mode, but we do want you to interact and engage with your fellow participants and with our presenter. So please feel free to utilize that chat section that should be located on the right-hand side of your screen within Whova. You do also have the ability to unmute yourself. So I'm trusting that we'll use that ability responsibly. And if you have a question or a comment when it is appropriate, feel free to unmute and ask your question. This is a recorded session, and the recording and materials from today will be made available on the ICSPS Forum for Excellence website. And here in a bit, I will type that link into the chat so you have access to that as well. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Shanna Shipman to discuss the traumas of COVID.
Oh, such a cheerful topic for late Friday afternoon, right? But thank you so much, Brittany. I appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone who has joined us today. This is a very important topic. I won't make light. I'm thrilled to be here to discuss this with you. And without further ado, we'll jump in. But why don't we go ahead and introduce ourselves in the way that we can. As Brittany said, the chat function is up and running. I've got it right next to me so I can follow along. If you don't mind, just type in there. Thank you, Mary Lynn has already. Type in your name, your professional role. And I would love to hear just a few words about your professional purpose, your mission, why you're in this session or why you do the work you do. Just a few words, a bumper sticker, a sentence. I think it's great to center on why as we get started. So I think it'll also be uplifting as well before we dive into some difficult topics. So go ahead and let me know in that chat and let all of us know your name, your role, and in a few words, what's really driving you? What brings you to this work? While you're doing that, I'll go ahead and introduce myself just so you know what perspectives I bring to the table. So I am a career educator and mom of four. And my teaching experience has spanned everything from early ed to middle school special ed to secondary to post-secondary. I've been all across the board. And I also then started working in this professional learning or professional development world for teachers. I worked for the Illinois State Board. And after that, went on to the American Institutes for Research, which is based out of Washington, D.C., and is a large social behavioral research organization committed to using that research to make lives better. So in that role, I worked mostly with state departments of ed across the country. So it's nice to be focusing back in on Illinois after being on each coast for a while. So we're going to go ahead and get rolling, but just wanted to let you know who I am. Why become trauma aware? Why attend this session? Why do our homework? Again, we're starting with why. Hopefully this links back to the mission, the purpose that you're feeling toward your work. Many of us are in the field of post-secondary education across the board to serve, to help people reach their fullest potential. And to do that, we need to honor all of the experiences that these individuals bring to the table. So trauma awareness to me is about building off people's strengths and acknowledging their experiences and how it impacts their learning. Besides just kind of those human connection reasons to care about this and to care about each other, there are also very tangible kind of educational outcome related reasons where we know that trauma impacts learning, and we know there are specific things we can do as far as our instructional practice to counter those effects, to help people cope, to build resilience. So we also care because of our educational outcomes that lead to professional outcomes that lead to outcomes for quality of life. So that's why we care, right? So trauma awareness really is an issue of equity. We want to make sure that no students are falling through the cracks, and that despite experiences in the past and how they may impact us today, we're serving all students to the best of our abilities. So there's my soapbox. That's why I'm here, and I'm assuming that's not far off from your reasoning as well. So today's objectives are fairly simple. We want to deepen our understanding of adverse experiences and resulting trauma and how they contribute to students. I'm going to use the word neurodiversity, how they contribute to how we think and how we learn. We want to consider trauma in the context of this ongoing pandemic, the resulting economic hardships, and the societal tensions that are exacerbated by those conditions. And there, I'm not going to be shy to say I'm really talking about structural racism, racial tensions, all that we have going on in society right now that can be impacting us. It's heavy. So we want to pay attention to context, and then we want to examine the impact of trauma on learning and adopt trauma-informed instructional approaches, or at least set out on the road to learn more about that. So what is trauma? It's an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful. The difference between stress and trauma is that trauma crosses this threshold where the events impact our ability to cope. So normally we have mechanisms in place neurologically to deal with stressors. If those systems are thrown out of whack, that's when we start talking about a traumatic response. And another characteristic of trauma is that it has adverse effects on the individual's functioning and well-being. So when we see the trauma start to impact lives, that's when we really need to tune in as far as trauma awareness. So I think of it as the 3 E's: an event, the experience, and the effects. It's really, really important to pause and consider that individual trauma responses vary by individual. Something that I experienced could be very traumatic to me. You could experience the exact same thing and not be impacted in nearly the same way. All of this has to do with several factors, including development, our own personal temperament, our perception of what happened, our history of trauma in the past, how we processed through the event, or what happened following the event. Were we supported? Were we nurtured? Were we safe? And that really gets to this idea of support systems. So that is the number one factor related to how we respond, and hopefully positively, from trauma, is our relationships, our support systems. So important note to keep in mind as we move forward. Going on a bit further before we pause and chat a bit, it's important to talk about types of trauma, I think. Trauma can be thought of as a single instance in time, an event. We call this acute trauma. Maybe this is a natural disaster, an accident, a loss, someone passes close to you, an episode of abuse. These are things, acute traumas, that can really have long-term lasting effects from one moment in time. When we talk about chronic trauma, we talk about trauma that's ongoing and repeated. Often abuse is more likely to fit into this category. Neglect. There are countless traumas related to and exacerbated by poverty. So while poverty itself is not automatically a cause for trauma, it certainly creates conditions in which trauma is more likely to occur. So it's important to pay attention to that socioeconomic link as well. Chronic trauma can really evolve into complex trauma, and that's when we start talking about how this ongoing exposure to multiple traumatic events really affects our development. We use this word complex trauma. And then I really want to pause on this idea of historical trauma, this idea that within communities, there may be a cumulative impact of trauma suffered by the group that could span generations. And we can think of really extreme examples of this throughout history. Prejudice, discrimination, oppression of certain groups of people, in some cases throughout our world history, attempted mass extermination of groups of people. Anything that's experienced by a group over time, through generations, we're starting to pay more and more attention to how that historical trauma can really impact individuals. So I'll pause right now on this idea of adverse childhood experiences, and this is all laying the groundwork for where we want to go with this, which are strategies to help. Adverse childhood experiences really came onto the radar in the late 90s when Kaiser Permanente, an insurance company, joined partners with the CDC to study how adverse experiences in our youth can impact outcomes down the road. Social outcomes, economic outcomes, and certainly health-related outcomes. And what was found was that the more adverse childhood experiences you had as a child, the more one would be likely to suffer certain health impacts. And these are behavioral choices such as substance abuse or other risky behaviors. But this also had to do pure and simple with physical outcomes, disease, conditions. The stress of these adverse childhood experiences were playing out physiologically. And that's really when we started as a society to pay a little bit more attention to this. But I'm going to point to some cognitive effects and learning effects at adverse childhood experiences. And just this one datum that young children exposed to 5 or more significant adverse experiences in the first 3 years of childhood face a 76% likelihood of having 1 or more delays in their brain development. So this comes into our classroom, and this has to do with how people learn. And this becomes increasingly important for us as educators. And you can slice and dice the ACEs data in many different ways, but that was one piece of data that I thought was significant to share. But of course, we know that trauma does not end in our childhood. Traumas continue throughout a lifetime, and really none of us are immune. This is not black or white. I have trauma, you don't. This is a gray scale where we can all think back to things in our lives that inhibited our ability to cope. Traumas occurring on college campuses. I know many of us are not in a traditional residential campus environment. We have lots of folks on the line through other educational venues, including our community colleges. But even in our community colleges, there are traumas happening on campus. Sexual assault is a huge one. That statistic that 1 out of 5 women would be sexually assaulted while in college. We know that's underreported, and we can't neglect the 4% of men either. So that's significant. There are traumas related to accidents and illnesses related to substance use. And some of our campuses have even undergone threats of mass violence or the realities of mass violence or shootings. So these are extreme causes of trauma. But then we start to shift to think about the current context and COVID-19 and what this pandemic means to us. So now we're dealing with illness or fear of illness, related economic hardships, related isolation, as we have to really flip our instincts upside down. And instead of reaching out and connecting with people during a hard time, we have to physically at least withdraw. So that's stressful, and for some to the point of traumatic. So we're going to shift a little bit into this current context. But before I do, I'd love to pause. I've been chatting for quite a while now. I'd love to hear if anyone has any thoughts or questions so far, just related to the background, that foundation we've laid in regard to trauma. Maybe you can share some of the traumas that you're witnessing in your own communities. Maybe you can share traumas that you've witnessed leading to needs in your classrooms. Maybe you can just share if you have a question about something that I mentioned that you'd like to hear more about. So I Don't know. I'm only seeing a couple comments in my feed, so I don't know if I'm seeing them all, Brittany. But we can also invite folks to go ahead and open their mics if they have comments at this time too.
Yes, absolutely. You can either put it in the chat, or if you know that you have a working microphone, please feel free to unmute yourself, and we'll kind of take turns here and be as interactive as we possibly can. So I did have one.
Yeah,
I did have one chat come through from Angelina. She says that Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris does some terrific work in regards to ACEs.
Oh, I'm a huge fan. So Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, hopefully you've seen her TED Talk and her videos and other things. We are touching ACEs with the tiniest bit of treatment today. I would really recommend diving deeper, and her work is a great place to start. So I really appreciate that comment. Nadine Burke-Harris, go ahead and jot that down. When you dig into the ACEs research, it's fascinating. Just how these experiences impact us as life goes on. So again, our power to combat these things is in awareness. So thank you for bringing that up. Let's see, anything else? Any other comments, questions, or clarifications? All right, feel free to pop in at any time. So let's dive a little deeper into context. What are we experiencing right now? This word unprecedented is used over and over, but it's absolutely true. We're experiencing unprecedented levels in stress and trauma related to just really basic needs, our physical safety and well-being. I don't know about you, but just this risk assessment fatigue, where every single move we make, we are countering against risk for our very own health. Economic security has plummeted for so many. For those still working and not losing their work, we have new work demands that are stressful. We have to reinvent how we do our work, and that kind of strips away our feelings of expertise in a moment. We have social unease and isolation. Even if we're getting out and about now, I don't know about you, it's very awkward, it's uneasy. We have to stay away from each other. It's tense, it's nervous, or we're isolated and we're just not having that connection that we know we need for our own mental health and well-being. Domestic relationships are strained. In severe cases, we know we're seeing rises of domestic abuse and violence. Folks are trying to deal with these stresses, and it's playing out that way. Societal, political, racial tensions, and just following the global news and impact. We're absorbing so much stress. It's unprecedented. It really is. So what else might we be experiencing along with those circumstances? Likely we're experiencing neurological impacts of trauma. And we're really going to dive deeper into that, because if there is one thing that I would like you to take from this shared experience today, I would love for you to just keep in mind that trauma has neurological impacts on us. Trauma, they're not choices, they're not predispositions or personality types. These are changes in the physical structure and functioning of our brain caused by trauma. And the reason for that, I'm going to oversimplify at this point. I'm going to oversimplify by saying that when we are in a traumatic response, either in a moment or ongoing, we are functioning more out of the back of our brain, our survival brain, if you'll allow me to give it that name. So these are the parts of our brain that monitor for threat, sound the alarm when there is a threat, activate our response to either get out of there or fight or do something. Our survival brain is activated in a traumatic response, and it takes over the thinking brain. When you think of our prefrontal cortex, those areas of the brain that are more related to rational judgment, decision making, I think of it as the brake. When we're running out of control, this part of our brain is our rational brake. This goes offline during a threat. And usually this is the part of the brain that will eventually bring us back online and come back into balance. But when in a traumatic state, we remain in that survival. For simplification, just for our sake of time today. But again, if you're into the neuroscience, I am, really dive into that in your own time. It's fascinating. So what does this look like? We can respond in many ways, and we tend to categorize these ways with these phrases. You've heard of fight or flight. I'm either going to take action and take on this threat, or I'm going to get away. And in our context, in modern society, this might not look like running out of the room. This might look like crossing my arms and refusing to talk or avoiding the situation. Freeze is closely related. This can look like someone spacing out, appearing numb, appearing disconnected. We can interpret their behavior to say they're apathetic. They don't care. But that's our interpretation that are unresponsive, especially in a classroom situation. There are countless issues of a young person or a person of any age in a freeze traumatic response that are being misinterpreted as apathetic or even disrespectful to the learning situation. So again, putting on that lens of why do we care? Why do we want a trauma-informed lens so we can see these situations a bit differently? Fawn is a response that has gained traction in the literature more recently. This idea that another F or another traumatic response that's observable is this idea of fawning or overly trying to us in order to avoid conflict. So that idea of fawn, avoiding trauma, dealing with trauma by pleasing everyone around you is real and documented by research as well. It's important to pause on this idea of trigger responses. This is when just the reminder of a past traumatic experience causes us to react as if we're in the traumatic experience at the moment. So these responses can be very out of context and appear confusing and out of place and misunderstood by others. So it's important, again, to put on those glasses, put on that trauma-informed lens, and maybe dig a little deeper behind the behaviors that we're observing, either professionally, personally, or really with our learners, with our students. We'll talk a little bit more about things that can happen in a learning situation that might be a trigger. So a little bit more on what this looks like, indicators of traumatic response. One way to kind of categorize this is there are indicators that indicate hyperarousal, where we're worked up. Here is when we can't manage emotions, feel agitated, get angry, overreact. Even the panic buying that we've witnessed in regard to the pandemic, that is a heightened state. That is, I'm going to fight this and take this on and be prepared. Obsessively watching the news. I don't know about you, but I am guilty of this. I've been tuned into news probably way too much since all this began. Trouble relaxing, trouble coming down, difficulty sleeping, and increased use of substances. This other idea of hypoarousal is what you might describe as being down, feeling emotionally disconnected, physically withdrawing, difficulty getting out of bed and starting your day and taking on your tasks, feeling foggy or numb, spacing out, feeling depressed, and again, changes in sleep as well as appetite. And not to belabor the point, but I think one more important way to look at all these indicators or clues or flags to us that trauma might be at play is to break it down this way. Those things that are emotional, those things that are behavioral, physical responses, we're talking about the headaches, stomach aches, nervous stomach, and then cognitive responses. And that's when we really get into how does trauma affect learning, not just for our youngest students, but throughout the lifespan. So we'll dig a little bit more into that. Are there any questions or thoughts about indicators of trauma before we move on? I'll peek at the chat as well to see if anything's coming through.
So we did have a comment from Anita saying that the concept of fawning was new to her, and she found that very interesting.
Yeah, me too.
And I know I can
Sorry to cut you
personally
off.
say all of the emotional, behavioral, physical, cognitive that you just described, I have experienced probably all of them within the last 6-7 months, as I'm sure we all have. So
Right,
very
right.
relatable.
Thank you, Brittany. I think it's important to just pause and commiserate. If only for that, like, I'm not crazy, we're not crazy value, right? Like, this is real. These are things that we're feeling. And it's important to touch base with each other and say, yeah, I feel that, or I'm experiencing that. Anita, that fawning concept was really fascinating to me too. I was deep into this work before I really got into that. And if you don't mind a side story, so I kind of gave you a brief overview of my educational professional life. Before that, I really worked in conflict resolution in multiple international settings. So I worked in Bosnia following that war. I worked in Kenya, and I worked with refugees from conflicts in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Rwanda. So that's when I really developed an obsession really with this idea of trauma and how it impacts us, especially because I was working mostly with children. And when I heard of that fawn response, immediately things started clicking for me, because with the children and the families I was working with in those contexts, I really observed this. They were okay, this kind of profusive need to just please people around them. And it was almost fear-based. And so it started clicking for me. So there's a little side note, but if you want to dive into that reading, I can share some resources on that. Okay, anything else before we move on? I also wanted to acknowledge this comment I saw earlier on from Carla. Like we said, like Brittany and I were just chatting about, this has had an effect on all of us. We're all experiencing our own trauma. So we're going to get more into that in a minute, but it's important to elevate that idea right now. Thank you, Carla. As we're going through this, like, let's be thinking of ourselves and what we're going through, because then we have this other layer of serving people who are dealing with their own traumas as well. So anything else, any other comment by voice or chat box before we move on?
Shanna, Lisa has a comment. She says, so we also need to gauge when and when not to address or incorporate it into our work with students.
Absolutely, absolutely. So important. Thank you for that. So there's a time and a place. And what we're really talking about today, and usually I mentioned this earlier on, so I'm so grateful for this insertion of this idea. Our intent today is not to become a mental health provider. We are not qualified. Some of you on the line might be, but I am not, and many of us are not. So as far as addressing trauma in our classrooms, today's conversation is really focused on this level of awareness and then universal instructional practices that will have positive impact on all of our students, but have a disproportionate, in a good way, impact for students who are bringing traumatic response into the classroom. So again, we're going to focus on these universal practices that can benefit all, but looking through a trauma-aware lens. And also today, I hope we're looking at ourselves through that same lens, so that we are better taken care of and better ready to do our work. So thank you so much for that. I think it was Lisa. Absolutely. What we are not advocating is pausing in the middle of an instructional setting and engaging in a way to try to deal with what we think might be going on with folks. Because to be quite honest, most of the time we won't know. You will not look at your sea of students and know who is dealing with what most of the time. If you do start to observe some of these things in class and have your hunches about trauma, there are ways to share resources without signaling out a student in a public context that would be really harmful. So thank you so much for that. Did you have anything else to add on that, Lisa? Or did I get to the point of what you were saying? Not to put you on the spot. All right, anything else before we move on? We've got lots of time. Okay, so now we know some things we might observe. You might be looking at this list and say, well, I observe a lot of those things, or I display a lot of those things, and they aren't related to trauma. Absolutely. This is not causal effect. This is not, if someone's irritable, they're obviously dealing with something big. We have a lot of reasons to be irritable. I have 4 beautiful reasons at home. my kids who I adore and make me irritable every day. So yes, let's acknowledge that this isn't an automatic thing. These are possible indicators. So let's shift into our focus on learning, what we do. We are agents of learning. So our students who are dealing with traumatic response might have difficulty processing information. I've heard students kind of describe it this way, that they're listening and they're attending and they're paying, physical attention, but they just hear wah, wah, wah from the teacher because the words aren't sinking in. It's kind of this mental fog. Difficulty regulating emotions, attention, behavior. Again, we can see some outbursts or different things in class that seem really odd to us. Difficulty forming trusting relationships with adults and peers. Kind of the self-isolation can be another impact because we know learning is inherently social and should be. So when people are withdrawn, that's going to inhibit their learning as well and really their healing. So we'll get more into resilience, but we know that relationships are that top factor in how we deal with trauma and our own ability to build our own resilience. So that's a really counterproductive response when we start breaking those relationships. So I'm just curious, can you think of any way that trauma response behaviors might be misinterpreted, either in your own instructional experience or your own institutions, or just in your own imagination or your own experience? And also I'll pose this question, how might just the regular functioning of a course, of a classroom, impact a learner dealing with trauma, or maybe even trigger additional trauma? And of course, we're not blaming here. Most of this, as we've said, we won't be aware of. So it's very hard to monitor every interaction and every stimulus in a classroom. So we'll be gentle on ourselves, but can we think of ways that the regular functionings of a learning environment might not be so helpful? Any ideas by chat or by voice? I really recommend that if you have a thought, even if it isn't fully formed in your head, go ahead and unmute yourself and jump right in.
Yeah, so we've had a few come through. Silence, defiance, resistance, anger, hurt. All of those could be misinterpreted behaviors.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that. And it sounds like folks are thinking of their own context. Maybe you're even thinking of an individual or a family that you know and all that they're going through. I think it's helpful to center in on people we're worried about and caring about as we learn this information and see how it might apply. We all have those students or have in the past that keep us up at night. I think that trauma awareness is taking that instinct of, oh, this person is going through a lot, they need something different, and then just enhancing our knowledge with what can we actually do that's different, because educators have long had concern for their learners. So we can talk a bit about resilience. Let's start looking on the upside here. Resilience is real. It's a positive adaptive response to this adversity. And relationships play a key role, as we've stated, and educators in those relational roles can play a really important function in helping one to build resilience. So here are factors, as we said, that first one, that are super important: supportive relationships. Other factors that can really aid our own resilience: a sense of mastery over life circumstances. So how do you see your locus of control? If you look at that Venn diagram of what's in your control and what's outside of your control, which one is predominant? This might be a mindset. This might be somewhat fictional in our mind, but how you see, how you perceive your mastery over your own life is big in regard to promoting resilience. Of course, the sad news there is the more adversity you're dealing with, and I think of impoverished situations especially, the more it can seem like nothing's in your control. Strong executive function and self-regulation skills help thinking brain. It can be very difficult to stay organized enough to create good outcomes that would encourage you to keep fighting the good fight. So this is chicken and egg. That's a symptom. Decreased executive functioning skills, but having strong or working on your executive functioning skills can be a boost as well. Safe and supportive environments, and that's where our institutions come in. We're talking, and I can give a whole other talk about institutionally what needs to happen on the system level to create a trauma-aware environment. Right now, we're focusing more individually and within classrooms, but some of these ideas might be applicable to the system. So really creating those environments where everyone's on board, everyone has knowledge, understanding, and looking at our individuals within the system with a trauma-informed lens. And you really can't rule out faith and cultural traditions. That's why it's important to honor these things in the classroom, not promote, not advocate, evangelize, but to honor the faith and the cultural traditions that people bring to the table. There's so much cultural richness that gets kind of cleaned out of our learning circumstances and our textbooks and in our materials or experiences. So let's not be afraid to really tap on that cultural richness as a strength. A little bit more about resilience. I just want to mention this isn't all or nothing. It's not black or white, switch on or off. I'm resilient, you're not. And this is a gray scale. This is a process. This ebbs and flows through our lifetimes. There are times when we really foster more resilience and times where we feel depleted. Many factors influence this. It varies by situation. It definitely varies by individual. This can be supported at any age. There is not one window of development at a younger age where we have to give a boost to promoting resilience and then they'll have it or not later in life at any age. This is intrapersonal, as in how we respond to our own thoughts and feelings. It's also interpersonal, how we react with others and how those relationships give us strength as well. So any ideas about resilience? Maybe things that you find to be helpful for yourself personally, for your students, for your colleagues. Let's see what's happening in the chat. Hopefully I've seen them. So glad we're talking about this as educators. Thank you. The example of the presenter today. Thank you. Thank you. A student with hiatus. How to address her own trauma. In terms of resilience, contamination theory, everything was fine until this came along. Yeah, that's a real thing to feel, right? And I think in the age of a pandemic, in the age of COVID-19, we certainly can look at that circumstance as kind of the huge straw that's breaking everyone's backs. How people think of their experiences, absolutely, that intrapersonal factor when we talk about resilience. So thank you, everybody, for making our side conversation in the chat rich. So what does the trauma-informed approach look like? What are the things that we can do? So now I am kind of talking system level, but I'm also talking individual. So whether as a system or as an individual professional, so I like the alliteration, you can tell. We can realize the widespread impact of trauma, just understanding prevalence, understanding that it impacts us all. Recognize the signs and symptoms. We've chatted a bit about this. Respond by integrating our knowledge about trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices. So we're getting practical now and pragmatic. So we'll dive in a little bit more to how to do that. And then that last R is resist. Seek to actively resist re-traumatization. So if there are instances where we do have an insight into what's going on and certain stimuli or occurrences could be re-triggering, we do our very best to stay away from those things. Let's talk about instructional considerations and get a little bit more concrete. Here's a list to look at. Create attachment or relationship within the class, between you and the students. I'm not talking, attachment maybe is a strong word that could hit people the wrong way. I'm just talking about authentic relationship. And I don't mean you have to know your student's favorite color. And I don't mean you have to hang out on the weekend. And I definitely don't advocate being social media friends. But I'm talking about when you are in proximity to each other, when they're in your presence. Helping folks who are obviously dealing with distress. That's what we touched on before. Often this won't be the case, but if this is the case, helping to kind of shepherd that person to resources or a situation where they can collect themselves and deal with what they're dealing with and also have some hope. Building self-worth, again, in an authentic way. I'm not talking about empty praise. I'm talking about authentic praise that deals with process and growth. I love how you're working so hard on that. You've come so far on this. I can really see your work. That's the type of self-worth. When we stamp our approval on a product or an outcome or a test grade, that's a certain level of praise that is circumstantial and is really more about us. When I say build self-worth with your students, I'm talking about centering on them and their attributes. So instead of, I really like what you created in my course, it is this creation that you've made really exemplifies your deep understanding of this, your hard work, and your ability to really stick with something. You know, that type of thing, centering on them in an authentic way. Here, let's get real practical about this one. Transitions can be hard for people who are dealing with trauma. So in your courses, you can think of ways where if you have things going on that might be overstimulating, how can you temper that a bit? How can you really incorporate some predictability into what you do? Because if somebody is bringing a traumatic response with them into the classroom, they're feeling out of control in most ways. So the tiniest bit of unpredictability, lack of control, shifting course can be disproportionately disturbing. So inevitably, these things are going to happen. You can't sterilize your environment or their experience, but if you can think ahead with that trauma lens, and how can I build predictability into their experience through the syllabus, through kind of forewarning conversations, regular protocol in your classroom, then that's going to really help. So these are practical things you can think about. And again, I'm going to end on this idea of executive functioning skills. And I want to kind of pause on an idea of flexibility. When you have on your trauma-informed lens and you're looking at your learners, this might not be the time to really kind of teach a lesson in the form of inflexibility. Folks might need a little bit more time. They might need a different mechanism to display their mastery of whatever skill or knowledge set that you're hoping for them. They might need various avenues to engage with the content. And I'd like to really promote this idea of being flexible. Some of you might be really into the concept of universal design for learning, just the idea that we're surveying the environment and we're reducing barriers to learning. And we're doing that in a way that really honors the various ways that learners absorb information, display their mastery, engage with the content, and interact with others. So if we can kind of honor that variousness with this trauma idea in mind, that's hugely helpful, and it's been proven in research to really improve outcomes both academically and then later on down the line for students. So honestly, that's a big idea that I'd love to pause on, and I'd love to hear what you're thinking. Can you think or add to this discussion practical ways that you can build that that honor for the various ways learners are going to engage in your classroom? So you can type it into the chat box or you can unmute. But what are other practical things you have done or you have witnessed that have really helped your students get through, especially at this time? Okay, so we do have one example. I was talking to an instructor friend who was really trying to engage in different ways electronically, as we all are, and she surveyed her students and said, what are the barriers? What are the things that are getting in your way of getting this work in and really learning from it? And she received lots of good feedback that way. So that's a great idea. Anything else? All right. moving along. So if we really broke down what trauma-informed instructors can do to kind of make life better in these ways, I think we have 4 big ideas here. I think we're talking about caring. You're there already. You showed up today. You're engaged. You're learning. You're creating your own awareness, which is the next big step. We talked about flexibility, talked about making sure we're focused on the learning and the mastery of our learning objectives. And there might be variety in how folks can get there. And again, pointing to the resources. So think to your own institutions. How can you make yourself aware of what's available for folks that are needing more help? And how can you point them to those resources? And I'm talking about practical things, posting in your rooms, adding to the syllabi, making sure that you're discussing these things at the top of the year, but also throughout the year, and especially discussing in relation to what folks are experiencing right now. So several of you I can see in the chat have brought up this hugely important concept of yourselves as a service provider and as an educator, and also this idea of secondary traumatic stress. So we talk about secondary traumatic stress when we put words to what so many of us experience, this kind of emotional distress that we take on just by hearing or learning about the firsthand traumatic experiences of others, especially our students. So some people will actually experience symptoms similar to those who have experienced trauma themselves. Secondary traumatic stress is absolutely evidence proven, and it's real, and there are things that you can do to help. I don't know about you, but when people come to me personally and say, make sure you're paying attention to self-care, make sure you're making time to, I don't know, take a yoga class or take a walk, I have a mixed reaction to that, because to be honest, there's not too much room in the day for something like that. So rather than focus on very specific kind of to-do items related to self-care that may or may not speak to each of you, I think maybe it's more helpful to talk about the larger rocks, to talk about the dimensions of self. These dimensions are going to be more powerful for some than others, but they are all proven effective as far as giving us the tools we need to build that resilience to not only better serve others, but take care of our own needs, especially at a time of unprecedented stress. So you can check out those dimensions of self-care, take mental note, what really speaks to you, and then pledge to yourself to prioritize that in whatever way, shape, or form that might take for you. So as we begin to wrap up some of this content and hopefully go into just more of an exchange and conversation about this, I think I'd just like to pause on this idea of a mind shift. So many people say, well, what can we do? What can we do to help someone who's going through something traumatic? And sometimes they are practical measures like those that we listed. And sometimes it's just putting on a different lens of awareness. So instead of asking, why is this person acting this way, or to be honest, why is this person doing this to me? Is a trauma-informed lens would move us to ask instead, how has this person's experiences impacted them and how they best learn? And really, how might that be on display in this context that we share in a classroom? So again, walking out of here today with a couple big neurological. Trauma response is not a choice, it's not an aptitude, it's not a predisposition or a personality trait. It is something physically happening in the brain. And it requires of us this mind shift. Not why are you doing that to me, but what has happened perhaps to you. Again, centering back on this ultimate goal of equity in our learning environments. We want to make sure no learner is left behind, and really honoring this neurodiversity, although it's invisible, it becomes visible and becomes our reality in many ways, is one way to really take note of the diversity in our class, make sure that our practices, our policies, our procedures are more equitable when we keep in mind what people might need to reach their learning goals. So, Brittany, I think I'm going to stop there for now. We only have a few minutes left. I would love to open up for some conversation. And really, I don't need to guide it too much. Maybe we can just ask folks to share what's on their mind, if they need further clarification, if they have ideas that are sparking that they'd like to chat about. So can we go ahead and open that up now?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a lot of conversation happening in the chat. Some great conversation actually, and people are sharing some information and videos as well to help support students and really opening this conversation up about trauma. I do want to share with everyone on
Excellent.
the call today that this fall we will be working, and I mean ICSPS and ICCB, will be working with Shanna to provide some more information on trauma. And we have more coming out regarding all of this as well. So keep your eyes posted on the ICSPS webpage because this is our bread and butter. This is what we love to talk about. And so we will be having more professional development coming up on this as well. But let me look through here for some questions.
Yeah, I've got the chat now open next to me as well, and I'm looking through as well. I'm not sure where we left off on this. I'm going to hone in on what Julie has said real quick about, I'm a big start a conversation and let people voice their own experiences. Inevitably, one student will say me too. Yeah, creating room for that self-sharing, I think, is huge. You're all skilled enough to know how to redirect a conversation if needed, when needed. But letting people tell their own story in an appropriate outlet is powerful. So I'm appreciative of that. What else are you seeing on there, Brittany? Kind of jumping around.
Yeah, so Carla has asked, does anyone have an idea of how to talk about trauma with a group of students so they understand themselves better, but yet let them know they can make changes to become better?
Yeah, so was that question posed to the group? Because I would love to hear what others have to say on that before I jump in.
Yeah, I think it was both. And then Julie shared a video regarding ACEs that she says is a really good way to kind of get that conversation started.
And I think just honing in on really on the brain. I mean, that's the difference, right, of where we are now and when the ACEs study was conducted in the late 90s. We understand more each day that this is a brain issue and that malleability neurologically works both ways. So not only can people be experiencing these kind of detrimental effects of trauma, and that, you know, that has a certain root in the functionings of their brain, but that it works in the other direction, that resilience is proven to be boosted, to be enhanced, to be supported by very specific factors. And if we know what those factors are and surround ourselves by those factors, then we see the results. So really that focus on resilience and how to get there actively as your own agent of your circumstances, I think is really helpful. That the trauma itself, the acute experience, might have been something that happened to you, but your response is within your sphere of control. So then again, I go back to all of that research, all of that work on how you perceive your own sphere of control and your own mastery over your own life, and how absolutely critical that is to not only coping mechanisms, but this onward growth toward just overall resilience and the ability to keep moving. So any conversation that really leads to that and focuses on that, I think is super helpful. Anybody else have any ideas?
We did also have a few people mention the movie Paper Tigers and how that can be a really good tool to kind of start that conversation with youth about trauma.
I agree. I second that recommendation. Check that out. It's worthwhile. Let's Let's see, what else? Any questions that we should be sure to address in our last 3 minutes? You have a big job, Brittany, because this conversation is really robust and incredible. It's a lot to, I'm trying to catch up. Okay, I think some people in here could give this presentation or contribute so much. That's what I love about this. This is really a collaborative effort. And as we, meaning this partnership with ICSPS, as we continue to provide resources and these types of gatherings and opportunities through the coming year, I would just love to tap into all this kind of collective expertise because there's a lot to learn from each other here. Brittany, how do we save this chat? Can we do that? Put you on the spot.
I think it saves it within Whova, but you know what? I can copy it and paste it into a Word doc just to be extra sure.
I appreciate that because there are some resources here that I don't want to lose. Okay, our last couple of minutes. Would anyone like to unmute and share any reflections? Anything that was an aha moment for you today, or anything that you'd like to bring to the table for others that we haven't touched on? And I'm also just really appreciating the gratitude in the chat. Thank you. This has been a pleasure. I didn't explicitly mention this, but there's a really fascinating body of research around the power of gratitude in dealing with traumatic stress. So these studies are pretty remarkable, showing that the more one is kind of wired or intentionally wires themselves to acknowledge the good and to be grateful, the more that those traumatic responses, physical, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral, are alleviated. So that's an interesting body of work to look into as well. And interestingly, it doesn't matter what the subject of one's gratitude is. This could be spiritual, faith-based. One could show gratitude toward an individual in their life, gratitude towards self, others in general. That act of kind of active gratitude has really been elevated in the literature as an important tool. So you can take a look at that as we pause on this last thank you screen. I just want to thank everybody for joining us, for contributing. I can't wait to give more of my attention to the conversation in the chat and learn from all that you've shared. So stay in touch and look out for more because we'll be gathering on this topic again. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Brittany.
Yes, absolutely. Shanna, thank you so much for a wonderful session. And I just want to thank everybody that is on as well for such a great conversation in the chat and engagement. We really appreciate it. And thank you for your patience and grace with us as we put on our very first all virtual forum. We had some hiccups along the way, but I hope everyone was able to get some informative information that they can take back to their programs and agencies and really utilize. So this is the last session of the day. This is the end of the forum. Again, thank you so much. And I am hoping and willing it to be true that next year's forum will be face-to-face because I do miss actually seeing all of you. So thank you so much and have a wonderful weekend.